whether Americans recognize the threat or not. The threat still exists, so escaping it and turning a blind eye does not solve the problem. Russia acts whether we realize that it's a threat or not. So the more we ignore it, the further they come closer to the United States as well.
Hello. This week is the anniversary of Russia's invasion into the Republic of Georgia, using the exact same tactics that they would later use here in Ukraine. I was in Georgia in 2008 for that war, and I remember clearly reporting that this was a message from Vladimir Putin that he would no longer play by the international rules-based order, and instead he would strike out on his own, consequences be damned. No one listened. They should have. Moscow's tactics are always the same: divide and conquer. And so in an effort to get that message out, I spoke to a Georgian activist in Tbilisi, a member of the opposition Democratic Party, DROA, MarikaMikiashvilli. We discussed what's happening there, but also in addition, we discussed the larger fight, the common fight against the Kremlin. So, MarikaMikiashvilli, thank you very much for joining us on The Edge. It's a great privilege to have you here. So we're going to be talking about all things Georgian, but if you'll indulge me for a quick moment for my audience's purposes, because Georgia is a relatively small country and unknown in many places. My American audience might actually think we're talking about a place with peaches and election interference, but no, you are a small country of about 4 million people on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. It is indelibly a Western country. It used to be called Colchis, and those of us who are massive nerds for like Greek mythology might recognize Colchis from the story of Jason and the Argonauts, if you love the old Ray Harryhausen film, with the golden fleece, which is how Georgians used to pan for gold. They used to put a lamb's fleece in the river and then let it dry out and shake the gold out. Great story. Anyhow, now I bring that kind of ancient Greek history and connection to the Western world because this is not how Moscow sees Georgia. Moscow sees Georgia as part of its empire, not connected to the West, but rather inside Russia's sphere of influence and basically a client state with no self-determination. Sounds very familiar to those of us who live in Ukraine. And we see a lot of similarities about how Russia treats Georgia as to the way it treated Ukraine and fabricated the conflict with a separatist movement here in Ukraine, in Donbass. Well, they did the same thing in Georgia with a region called Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I even remember the 2008 war where that kind of all happened. They have occupied these separatist areas, aggravated and destabilized Georgia, and continued to try and gain more influence and power. The difference perhaps with Georgia is that they were successful in replacing the leadership in the capital with a puppet government. All of this circles round to just a preliminary question, because we are here in Kiev and you're there in Tbilisi. Do you feel any kind of solidarity and similarity for the struggle that is happening here in Ukraine and what you are currently going through in Georgia?
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for invitation. It's an honor to be here, and it was a very on-point, great introduction of Georgia. Yes, definitely. From the first day, from 2014, of course, beginning from that time, Georgians are in solidarity with Ukraine, with Ukrainians, and The Georgian Legion has been fighting since 2014 in Ukraine, but especially, of course, after the full-scale invasion happened in February 2022, there was a research poll done at the first days of the full-scale invasion, and 87% of Georgians responded that this is our war too. So yeah, there's a very high level of solidarity with the Ukraine, that we perceive it as our cause, our war as well. Um, and there are many interesting details to this story. I can dive into it. For example, the use of Ukrainian flag as one of the symbols of Georgia as well, and of Georgia's resistance to this Russian regime that we have now as a government. So yeah, there are many aspects
One of
of
the
the
things,
solidarity.
one of the things that brought a tear to my eye and touched me deeply is after the full-scale invasion, I saw a Georgian choir. And for those of you who don't know Georgian culture, music and dance and food is very important. Georgian, and it has a long, long history and is beautiful, beautiful culture. I saw a Georgian choir singing the Ukrainian national anthem as Russian bombs were falling on Kiev, and it moved me deeply. I wonder, Marika, one of the things that frustrates me as being an American is that while the former Soviet Union and the places that lived under Moscow's thumb fully understand the threat coming from Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, we can't seem to get traction in the West, perhaps in Europe better because of the proximity, but especially in America. It is very frustrating for me as an American who lives here and has studied and lived in this region, covered this region for a long time. And we will get on to Georgia itself in a quick moment here. But before I do, what message would you send to Americans when we talk about this common cause battle against Vladimir Putin's Kremlin and the Russian Empire? If you had a message to send to Americans about the threat from that empire, what would you say?
Well, I would probably say that whether Americans recognize the threat or not, this threat still exists. So escaping it and turning a blind eye does not solve the problem. And just to look at the history, the very recent history. So Georgia, this remote country of mine from the United States, in 2008, we had this Russian invasion. And Russia did not really get punished for their actions. Quite the opposite. The Russian reset by President Obama happened very quickly after invasion of Georgia. And we saw that it didn't really yield any beneficial results for the United States. And then the same scenario, same Georgia playbook was used by Russia to invade Ukraine. And Antony Blinken outright called it a Georgian scenario days before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So Russia acts whether we realize that it's a threat or not. So the more we ignore it, the further they come closer to the United States as well. It might seem that Europe is far away, but the 20th century history showed us that anything that happens in Europe has a direct consequences in the United States. So the further away Putin is stopped, the better for the national security of the United States. Yeah, especially
I agree 100%.
Yeah. Especially that, sorry interrupting, but Putin is allied with China, Iran, and all other states, rogue states that, like North Korea, they get military supplies from North Korea and Iran, for whom United States is an outright enemy. So,
And not to mention, and I'll say this for you to my American audience that perhaps you're being too polite to say, is that also Georgia has been a very strong, stalwart ally to the United States, even going so far as to deploy troops to Iraq in the effort there. Whatever you feel about the politics of the Iraq War, Georgian soldiers were on the ground in Iraq. I remember one time going into the palace, the palace in Baghdad there, which had been turned into the kind of provincial authority, and there were Georgian soldiers protecting the entrance to the Congress there. And we had a good laugh about missing like certain delicacies from Georgian food, which is amazing, like kimali and things like that. Anyhow, let's talk about Georgia. Let's talk about Georgia itself, because while there are similarities and while this is a common cause fight, there are some specifics to what's going on in Georgia that I think the West and my audience and Americans in particular should be paying attention to. After years and years of kind of shaky development in Georgia, which was always kind of interfered with by Moscow, you had the 2008 war, as you mentioned there. There was a reform party led by President Mikhail Saakashvili, who was trying to make reforms in Georgia, but was undermined by this party clearly allied with Moscow and led by a, in essence, Russian oligarch who happened to be Georgian. And they brought in this party, Georgian Dream, and they instantly started to destabilize civil society and any kind of reforms or progress that had been made. Tell me about Ivanishvili and the Georgian Dream Party and what that has done to your country, that thinly veiled ally of Moscow.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, there was this 2008 war, and by the way, the anniversary of the outbreak of the war is August 7th. So just now, basically.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yes, and I personally remember the war as well. Anyway, so Saakashvili government, the reformist government, they had lots of amazing reforms, things that people didn't think it would be possible, not just in Georgia, but elsewhere as well. Like they really eliminated corruption big time. They fired the entire road police overnight and recruited new people. So yes, Georgia was a success story in many ways. But well, especially at the end of his second term, like there were mounting allegations of human rights violations and so on. So there was discontent in the public against him. But also there was a big chunk of people who hated him for his reforms, like those people who have this post-Soviet mentality and
who benefited from the similar corruption that you see in Russia.
Exactly. So at the end of his term, he was disliked very much by these post-Soviet people, and also by people who, and to a degree, also by people who used to be his core support, this educated middle class. But their grievances were very different. However, at the ballot, at the voting pressing, most people voted for this Ivanishvili party. Ivanishvili was a, Russian-made ethnic Georgian oligarch. And I think he was the biggest individual shareholder of Gazprom's assets. He held 1% of Gazprom's assets. Anyway, I think he gave up on it before becoming Prime Minister of Georgia. But everything is so murky. I can't say things for sure.
Mm-hmm.
However, the expectations and the mood in Georgia. Since in 2012, when they came to power, it seemed like the United States had retreated from the region to a degree. And also the European Union had no clear vision and strategy for our region. There was this Russian reset and so on. So people, wrongfully, in my opinion, but still people thought that it was possible to somehow have better relations with Russia, to have someone who can talk better with Russians or something. So there was this fatigue, there was this irritation with the constant crisis happening in the country. in addition to of internal grievances and human rights, and so on. So Ivanishvili positioned himself as someone who could walk a fine line between European integration and having better relations with Russia. But I want people I don't want people to think that we consciously elected a pro-Russian guy. That was not the case. I mean, people wanted somewhat better relations with Russia, not to be on the verge of an hot war every day, but how to say, it was not seen as a pro-Russian choice. People still very much wanted European integration. This Ivanishvili guy, he promised European integration, he promised to deliver it. And I would also say that there was, and until very recently, until the last months of protests that we'll probably discuss later, there was this false sense of security in society and also in political class that since Georgians are such a pro-Western society and about 85% of people consistently support European integration and are extremely favorable to the United States, that it's impossible to turn the country back to the Russian orbit. So people thought that we held the checks and balances. And to a degree, maybe back in 2012, it was correct because Ivanishvili was not able to make some drastic changes and drastic overnight shifts towards Russia. He did it very consistently, very subtly, very determined over 12 years. Of course, many people saw who he really was from the first day that he appeared in politics. And it was possible under a watchful eye to see him undermining the country from the very first days. But for the average population, the couple of years that he first held power, it seemed like it seemed that the life had become a little better in the ways that there was not enough harm done yet, but also they were more liberal in terms of prison. They wouldn't jail people for the same reasons that the previous government would, and it seemed like the human rights were becoming better. And to a degree, actually, judicial process towards average ordinary citizens became a slightly more favorable than before. So I'm not talking about the small circle of experts or people who instinctively knew what was happening. I'm talking about the broad population. For many people, it was it flew behind the radar, or what's the expression?
Flew under the radar.
Flew under the radar.
I get the impression, Marika, that it was kind of like what Saakashvili was trying to do was the hard reforms that needed doing, which people didn't like because they're difficult, and making you adhere to the rule of law is a difficult thing to do when you've had centuries of occupation by Moscow, which doesn't care about the rule of law, they just care about power. And so, as difficult as it is, if you're able to pay off a police officer, or if you're able to pay off a city official or a government official, that's easier than doing the hard work of actually making those reforms. So they didn't crack down on the corruption because the corruption was part of the system, which some people actually kind of like because it is easier. I've seen that kind of pattern. We saw it here in Ukraine. I've seen it in Georgia. I've seen it all throughout the Russian Empire and in Russia itself. So I totally understand that. But it gives me a shiver up my spine when you're talking about how Ivanishvili kind of slowly crept in and chipped away at this right and that right and undid this reform and undid that. We are learning that democracy is not as resilient as we'd like, even in America. And so I feel a little uncomfortable because it almost sounds like you're talking about a certain candidate for president who had a shot once and now wants to go at it again. and what that could mean. So, look, he comes in. Georgian Dream comes in. They undo a bunch of reforms. They let loose the corruption because it feeds into their way of how they want Georgia to run. But then they bring up this foreign agents law, and I guess could you just briefly explain what is the foreign agents law in Georgia?
If I may just go a little
Sure.
behind. You are absolutely right. They undid the reforms. They captured the state and pocketed all state institutions. And in 2015, there was this Radio Liberty / Radio Free Europe study that Ivanishvili's personal assets compared to Georgia's GDP was 35%. So he had 35% of Georgia's GDP in personal assets, in comparison. And you can
of the entire nation, 35% of the entire nation in GDP. One man.
Yes,
who happened to also be the president. So you've got an oligarch who not only controls things, but is actually integral to your economy. That's terrifying.
Not entirely. It's not like he holds 35% of Georgia's actual GDP, but his wealth is equal to 35% of Georgia's GDP. But nevertheless, But it's insane. Plus, if you add his networks and all his friends and oligarchs and family or whatever, they have disproportionately, unimaginably bigger resources than anyone in the country. And actually, I think it was the Ambassador William Courtney, former ambassador to Georgia of the United States. I think it was him who said that no other person in any post-communist country had as much influence as Ivanishvili has in Georgia. And there was also this terrible electoral system because we had the system disproportionately favoring the first party, that the party that got most votes. I can dive deeper into it if needed. But anyway, so he never really had even half of votes after the first time he was elected in 2012. But he held the entire parliament, entire state system, and entire administration of the state, because also Georgia is an extremely centralized state, because whoever holds the government, they also have all the local mayors. The municipalities are not really independent because we have really bad electoral and state administration system. So all of this, the laws and the resources really favored him, and he subtly but surely captured the entire state. But he was a prime minister until 2013, so for a year or so. And then he was the behind-the-scenes guy. He was a shadow ruler and still is. So he has this appointed
the gray
prime
cardinal.
Minister.
The gray cardinal behind the curtain or pulling the strings.
Yes, exactly. So the foreign agents law, they had this first attempt to introduce it last March, in March 2023. And in my understanding, it was it was a little rushed. So, well, yes, it was rushed because the society rejected it very much. It was a huge punchback at the government that the protesters gave them last March. So Ivanishvili himself is not a person who rushes through such decisions. So I always had this feeling that it's Russia pushing for the law, but it became even more visible this year because this year in March, Kyrgyzstan adopted the same foreign agents law, which they had been eyeing for 10 years but didn't do. So the day after the Kyrgyz president signs this foreign agents bill into law, Georgia reintroduces it. So last year, they adopted the foreign agents law at the first hearing, but there were huge demonstrations, a couple of days of great street fights and crackdowns and so on, and they backtracked and they voted it down on the second reading. So we beat the law last year. So this year, right after Kyrgyzstan, we introduced it, and then in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the Serbian federal part, there's also an attempt to introduce this law. Hungary brought it back. Slovakia also plans on some restrictions of NGOs, and in May there was talks that in Serbian parliament they are also just beginning to discuss the law. So first, what the law is about? It requires any organization that receives at least 20% of their funds from abroad to register as foreign agents. Now, this might seem very innocent for many, but it's important to understand the Georgian context. First of all, the Russian propaganda and the government propaganda say that it is identical to the United States foreign agents registration.
Yes, I've heard that.
Which it is not. No. Because FARA mostly concerns lobbyists, but this concerns anything from single mothers shelter to animal shelters and so on. And also, like in Georgia, there is not really any independent money. The only person who is confident in his wealth is this Ivan Ishvili person who has captured the state. And other businesses in Georgia, and they are not they don't feel okay to fund CSOs or the opposition, because under a captured judiciary, they can have a crackdown of their business overnight and no one will protect them. So they're very careful about funding CSOs, knowing that the government doesn't like CSOs.
And I'm sorry, CSO,
a civil society organization. Yes, civil society organization, sorry. Yes, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, I will use them interchangeably in this discussion, basically. Yeah, so the thing is that in Georgia, Georgians cannot really fund CSOs to the point that they function. So all organizations need foreign support, and that is US money and European Union money, the Western money, basically. And oftentimes these non-governmental organizations, they do things that the government doesn't. Like, they behave on behalf of the government. Like, for example, they have lots of programs in support of children with disabilities, like single mothers, and so on, programs that the government doesn't have, and there are so many beneficiaries, and they're making lives of so many people.
Is that because of the corruption in the government? Is it because of the frankly the not poverty, but the lack of funding within the government? So you have to have an external body doing those kind of things. What is the cause? Why don't they do orphanages and women's shelters or whatever else?
So it's a bit of everything, I suppose. Mostly just lack of interest, I would say. But in any case, the private sector usually can do things better than public sector. So they offer really good services. And also a very important aspect.
So you need this outside money.
We absolutely need this outside money for any civil society organization to function in the country. Because if we don't have this outside money, it's just the government in Georgia and their proxy organizations. That's it. And there might be enough resources to barely maintain a couple organizations that will be there as a small cell of resistance, but that's it. It won't really actually have impact on the society. And very important thing is that in Georgian language, and it's partly Soviet legacy, the word agent means a spy. So agent means a spy. A spy means a foreign. A spy means traitor and an enemy of the nation, basically. So spy means that you're working for a foreign government. You're not working for your nation. You have someone else's interests on your mind. So when they call us, or everyone, like foreign agents, they're saying that we're traitors and enemies, and they're doing it outright. Like, it's not written in the law, but in their announcements and talks, and whenever the government comments on something, that's what they say. These people are foreign agents, traitors of their nation, and enemies. So they do the whole package together. And we had this. They vandalized the home entrances of activists and my friends, and that's what they write. Here lives the traitor. Here lives the enemy of the nation, a foreign agent. And also,
Well, see,
like,
okay, so
Yeah.
so this is one of the things that I have heard from my Georgian friends and colleagues, is that aside from the illegitimacy and the way that the law is structured, there's also concerns that maybe we don't have in the West compared to like FARA, is that not only is it how the law is stated and put onto the books, but how the law is implemented. Because as you see it in particularly in Russia, but obviously in these other areas where they've adopted similar laws, this is not about actually the law itself, but using it as a weapon
Yes.
to pursue your political enemies as an excuse. So it's not just the law itself, which obviously has major flaws in the law as it's structured, but it's also how the government uses it. That's completely different than what we have in the West.
Absolutely.
This is a weapon. It's a weapon that they are trying to put into their own hands so that they can silence any kind of opposition who may be getting benefits from or money from the West, but who really are concerned with Georgian civil society. The government, however, uses it as an excuse to crack down. I mean, this, writing people's names on their doors and veiled threats and that kind of stuff, that's not about protecting Georgia from outside influence. That's about punishing your opponent.
Definitely. And on April 29th, this Georgian Dream government and this Bidzina Ivanishvili, the shadow ruler, the Grey Cardinal, they had this sham rally. So they brought people from regions. There was huge pressure on public sector workers to come. And by the way, they pre-recorded a clap sound. They had pre-recorded clap sounds at their rally. It's not a joke. It really happened.
That's Moscow. That's Moscow. That's right out of their playbook.
Yeah, definitely. Like most things in Georgia right now, unfortunately. So at that rally on April 29th, Ivanishvili directly said that NGOs are a tool in the hands of the West to have a revolution in Georgia and impose a foreign government in Georgia, and that Georgia is not Ukraine of Yanukovych. So he basically said that I'm not Yanukovych, and that this law is
which
necessary.
was Ukraine's puppet.
Exactly.
Ukraine's Russian puppet.
Exactly.
So he's claiming he's not, but I mean, he clearly is.
I think what he meant in this regard is that he will not be overthrown through a revolution like Yanukovych was. Yes, so he said that you're not getting
no
rid
Maidan
of me.
In Georgia.
Yeah, exactly. It's big part of their big part of their propaganda that there will not be a revolution, so a Maidan in Georgia, which they are blaming on Georgian fighters in Ukraine, on the West, on the USAID, by the way, and so on. So he said that is why we need this law. We need this law to expose and limit these NGOs who are preparing a regime change in Georgia. And so he exposed all of their intentions, and then they still keep saying that this is about transparency. But also another important issue here is that so by how to word this, if I'm a foreign agent, so an enemy and a traitor, since I'm receiving foreign money, for example, I personally am not, but just saying, like, in general.
I understand. Hypothetically.
Hypothetically, yeah. If I'm receiving Western money and I'm an enemy of Georgia because of that, means that the West is also an enemy for Georgia, right? Why would I be an enemy if I'm taking money from a friend? So they are flipping friends and enemies by just the very introduction and name of the law. And in Georgian understanding, the West has never been something alien or something imposed on us.
No.
Yeah, it's very integral for us. And it's very like we are instinctively pro-Western and think we are a Western country.
I've been there many times. You are.
Yeah.
You are. You are a Western country. You have the same shared values. You have an atmosphere of a civil society that very, very closely, is like Western. So now they had problems in last year where they tried to get, but then they kind of they maneuvered it through. Talk a little bit about how ultimately the foreign agent law did come to pass, as it were.
Oh yes. So last year, for example, I remember that we were having a big meeting with opposition and CSOs, and we were thinking like, will the people protest at all? And we were so positively surprised last year that not only did we protest, but we also like actually made them back off through a through something that I would call the last year's demonstrations some sort of a mental cultural shift in Georgia, because Georgians always used to be very timid protesters and very much afraid not to get labeled as aggressive by the government and so on, in my living memory at least. And last year, suddenly no one cared, and they were extremely fierce in like punching the police back. And that was the young generation, and it became a sensation. Like Gen Z became sensation in Georgia last year because they were not suddenly they were not demonstrating the same cultural norms as the generations before, and it was to our benefit in this case because they were not as shy and timid as their predecessors. And I think we surprised the Kremlin very much. Like, we caught them off guard, and that's why they backed off, because like in a couple of days, this no to Russian law would become no to Russian government last year, and they were not prepared for that. So now they had an entire year to prepare or whatever, or to think that they are prepared, and they brought the law back. So we had demonstrations for 2 months. And there were so many things that were new to Georgia in these demonstrations. For example, in general, it's always stereotypically Georgians are known to be almost headless without a leader. So we need a leader, need a charismatic leader to follow, to protest something or to achieve any cause. That's one. The second is that if we don't achieve our objectives very quickly, then we get very tired in a couple of days and then put in half efforts and go home. And the third stereotype is that Georgians don't really self-organize, which is connected to the previous two. I would say that to a large degree, these stereotypes have been mostly true. But this year proved everyone wrong, and us Georgians chiefly, because it was an extremely decentralized protest without any visible political leadership or any centralized leadership. It was very self-organized and also very enduring in time and efforts. And it was very surprising for us. We were like very positively charged by all this energy. But
in a country of 4 million people, a little less, you had hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets of the capital, Tbilisi,
every day.
Every day for days on end, against water cannons, against everything that they threw against you. I have covered Georgia. I've been to Georgia many times. I have never, when I saw those pictures, it took my breath away, and I was, whoa, this is new. This is something very different. And then, of course, also one of the things that was so heartening for me to see was that the pictures of that young person who was carrying the EU flag and dodging the water cannons. I mean, it was deeply inspiring, and it was amazing that you were able to field those numbers. And when I wanted to do something on Georgia, because our program here, our show is about, this kind of the edges of the Russian Empire and the clash between East and West. And when I said, well, I obviously have to do something about Georgia because it isn't just Ukraine that is involved in this struggle. I need to talk to somebody from Georgia. And I asked around to my colleagues and my friends, and I said, who do I need to talk to? And they suggested you, but they suggested you due in no small part to the fact that you got to talk to the young. This is a youth movement that is happening in Georgia. This is about the future. It's about generations that are going to live and grow up in whatever kind of Georgia you develop. And do you agree that this is? You talk about how it wasn't. It was kind of Gen Z and the kind of, interconnectivity of the web and things like Telegram and Signal and all these different apps that younger generations are more, in tune with, that enabled them to have that massive turnout. Do you agree that this is very much a youth-oriented movement, and what does that mean for Georgia?
So I think the youth has been the most visible and the most active, definitely. And the youth also brought a different touch to what Georgians were used to or politically socialized into before. For example, my mother's generation and my mother's friends, they compare this what's been happening in Georgia to the national liberation struggle in 1980s when we were struggling for independence under the Soviet Union. But they underline that there are differences. For example, back then it was very much leader-centered, and now it's not. But also that this youth is much more light-spirited and more acquainted with freedom in general and spirit of freedom, and that their attitude, their upbringing has been much lighter in a good sense than the Soviet youth. For example, even the songs back then in the 80s, the songs were tragic, patriotic, but tragic and very heavy. And right now we had this extremely pleasant, almost like almost like a birthday or a disco or some aura, very light-spirited aura. And in that regard, the youth has really had a big impact on this movement, and also with the new methods of resistance to the police. I would say they're very flexible. They're quite self-organized, and it was almost like from a 19th century book about national liberations in Europe when they took an oath in front of the heroes memorial, like a fallen heroes in wars of Georgia memorial. They took an oath that they will protect Georgia from these Russians and just in general from Russians, and not give up on our country, because we really have this feeling that it's not just the law. We're losing our independence to Russia, because if we're cut off from the West, then we are alone towards Russia. And then Russia can consume us whenever it pleases. We cannot be alone vis-a-vis Russian mercy, which doesn't exist. Yeah. But I would also like to underline that it's not just the youth. So the youth is the most visible part, definitely. But this is very broad and encompasses all generations. Like maybe statistically, the retired are less invested.
Well, there were too many people on the streets to it have just been a youth movement. I think there's a very large movement. Exactly. But I want to, before we move on, I want to draw a conclusion to those massive protests where they came out on the streets. I was deeply concerned that it was going to turn violent and bloody, that it would be a Maidan with the Heavenly 100 who were shot here by the authorities. I was deeply afraid that blood would flow into Tbilisi, but miraculously it didn't, and things did kind of simmer down. And before we touch on why that might have been, run me through how the protests kind of came to a conclusion, or perhaps better to say another phase of opposition that didn't involve street protests. But I think very wisely, the temperature was taken down. Talk to me a little bit about that, how those massive protests ended without a lot of blood.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this protest was the first time in general that the broad masses of Georgians realized that we're dealing with the Russian government. Yes, the protest spirit was very high. It was very fierce, but since the government was extremely determined to push through the law, and they did, they overturned the president's veto. I think the protesters and the political class and everyone, we just really wanted to avoid bloodshed, and since we have this October elections, and we always had this October deadline in our head, even when protesting in April, in May, we understood that yes, we are protesting firstly, but this will not be the last chance to get rid of this government. So we have this October deadline in our heads. So when they overturned the veto, people would rather, and the political class also would rather, go home, prepare for the elections very well, and unseat them through elections, rather than have a bloody revolution there and then, because it's just a matter of several months. Well, there was a lack of patience among some people, and many people were allergic to the fact that we would have to deal with this government for several more months. But in general, yeah. So we were very avoidant of blood, and we still are.
Well, I think that was smart.
Yeah.
No, I think that was smart, because it also would have been allowed that, because then there would have been a give and a take, and it would have allowed the government to crack down even harder. Ultimately, is my opinion. So I think and having spoken to so many Georgians after those massive street protests and the potential for it to turn bloody, the messaging I got from nearly every Georgian that I spoke to, friends and colleagues and associates, what have you, was that we'll settle this at the ballot box. We will
Yes.
not do this on the streets. We will take our vote to the ballot box. And I'm hoping that is true, because I'm hoping that you will have proper, free, and fair elections. But since the Georgian, this movement kind of lowered the temperature and decided to do this through political means, you've had several setbacks by the Georgian Dream party and the ruling class in government. And without going into the specifics of what those setbacks were, the government isn't waiting for the ballot box. They are undermining you as you approach the ballot box. Can the will of the people override what the government is doing to undermine you, to divide you and conquer? And also, do you think that with all of this in mind, that the elections will be free and fair?
I do not.
I know that's a lot to
Yeah.
I know that's a lot to unpack, but I don't want to
it's
get
a
bogged
very
down in the
on point.
specifics of how they've been attacking you, because the Georgian Dream is not just sitting waiting for the ballot. They are undermining you constantly.
Yes.
And that's, if folks want to learn about it, there's plenty of material out there to look it up. Just take my word for it. The Georgian Dream is definitely attacking civil society in Georgia, trying to undermine you before you go to the ballot box. Without going into specifics, what's that been like, and what do you think that means for the election itself and the legitimacy of that election?
Yes, definitely. It's very on point, the questions. Thank you. So I do not expect the elections to be free and fair, and no one does. But a lot will depend on our own mobilization and also external pressure. So our hope and focus has been that we should disorientate the system just enough for them to be unable to rig to the point that they stay in power, if it makes sense what I'm saying. Yes, so we want to disorientate them to the point that they can't rig the percentage to stay in power. But we do not expect it to be free and fair. It will depend a lot on lots of background talks and just on what's happening inside the Georgian dream, because there have been some different rumors, reports on the mood, on the confusion inside the party, because it's really they are doing whatever their master Ivanishvili, the oligarch, tells them to.
And by proxy, Moscow, and ultimately
of course, by proxy, Moscow, definitely. But but some of them at least realize the risks and realize what they have signed up for. And I don't know, we have been hoping that the very high voter turnout, mobilization of people, especially the young voters who will be the first time voting, and before this foreign agents law, which we call the Russian law, by the way, the youth were not really interested in politics, but right now they have managed to mobilize the youth, thankfully. Also another important point is the external pressure. Sanctions and travel bans against Georgian Dream and their enablers are extremely important. And sometimes I get asked, same happened in Belarus, Iran, and elsewhere and didn't help. But in Georgia, I think it is effective because most allies of the government, they are situational allies for the benefit. They are not unconditional ideological allies who will follow them to not, I don't know, political non-existence or something. So it is important, and especially family travel bans hit their enablers really hard. So if we do the combination of sanctions, and the United States has already imposed some sanctions on the enablers, I mean travel bans, not financial sanctions, at least yet, and also, Georgia is basically getting messages from the European Union that that our accession process has been frozen, and we cannot pursue our European integration with the same Georgian Dream government. The European Union countries and United States also froze assistance to the state budget of Georgia. So there's a lot happening, but the more the better. So the Georgian public needs to know that if they stay in power, that's it. That's it. The Georgians cannot be welcome in the Western world, maybe even physically, because the European Union might reintroduce visa regime for Georgians.
And one of the things that they love to do is divide and conquer. So, but one of the things that you are doing, I see, is that you are starting to make these unions of the different parties, so that what used to be smaller separate, lots of small separate opposition groups are now coming under one umbrella. Now, your party, DROA, is a pro-European liberal democratic party that wants to see those reforms, and you have allied yourself with others. I'm seeing so many things that are so similar in all the fights in all the countries against what Moscow and Russia does. Russia loves to divide and conquer. I see it in Georgia, I see it here in Ukraine, and frankly, I see it in the United States with their invasion into our body politic there. I mean, once you know their playbook, you see them so clearly, and I see the struggle so similar with what you're trying to do with a proper election that will be, in the words of our American election, too big to rig. And we have these kind of similar situations in the United States. So are you optimistic that you can coalesce into a one Georgian voice that will overthrow Moscow's puppet in the form of the Georgian Dream?
It is possible. The polls are definitely favoring the opposition in general, like the collective opposition. There are several alliances made now. Some parties still need to get grouped into alliances. So there could have been more optimal alliances, which did not happen, but this is not bad either. So let's see. But it really depends a lot on how out of touch from reality the Georgian Dream is, or how there are some things that keep us hopeful, which is different from Ukraine of 2014. For example, like Georgia is a very small society. Everyone knows everyone, and we have extremely low threshold of what counts as violence. If the police actually resorts to real bullets, I think they're absolutely done. The system might crack from within. Plus, apart from
There are more of you than there are of them. That's for
exactly.
sure.
That's true. For example, Yanukovych in 2014, this Russian puppet in Ukraine who killed people, he might have thought that he had, like in terms of foreign vector, Ukraine was split back then. So he might have thought that he has like more or less half of the population and he can crush the other half. But this is not the case in Georgia. Like whatever legitimacy the Georgian dream still has to the point is because they're still managing to lie to some part of population that they are also driving Georgia towards the European Union, just with a different path from the opposition, which is a more Christian, less LGBT, and so on. But
Georgia's a very traditional country.
yeah, definitely. Less so lately, but overall, of course, definitely. Yeah.
There's a bohemian movement
Yes.
in Georgia for sure, but yeah.
Yes, but like if it's not in their interest to go fully unmasked because they're losing extremely if they're absolutely fully unmasked, even more than today. And also the police is, as I said, the majority of the police is not their ideological ally or like something that cannot be cracked. They can be cracked. Maybe only some part of special forces will like follow them to whatever, but not entire security system. And also, it's very hard to put an actual Russian next to a Georgian security guy and tell him to like shoot at Georgians together with the Russian. Like this does not happen.
Yes.
So there are some hopeful indicators that the system just cannot deal with the big pressure. But again, it's important.
I think they'd rather sit down to a nice Supra, which is a lovely Georgian feast, than shoot at their fellow Georgians. And I don't think Moscow quite understands that.
I mean, I'm not saying that I have some idealistic understanding of Georgian police. I mean it in a very pragmatic way, like because people.
No, I understand.
It wasn't a reproach to you, just to be precise to the audience. These police people shooting, they have their own family members standing at the protest. It's a really small country, so like any blood is a huge deal. So it's like extreme risk for the Georgian dream to try to like crush the protest through blood. It is still like if they are completely out of touch from reality, in a way, like it's an unfortunate possibility. But
also if they play that bloodshed card and they lose, the consequences for them will be, they'll end up like Ceausescu in Romania. I mean, if they start the blood. Who knows how it will end for them? Because, as I say, there are more of you than there are of them. And just as an aside, before we move on, I dearly love Georgia. It's one of my favorite places on the planet. And so, just as a personal message to you, you can carry on to your fellow Georgians, is there are those of us who are keeping our eyes on Georgia, are well aware of what's happening on Georgia, and would be absolutely heartbroken if this does come to bloodshed. So I hope you've got it right there, and I hope that the powers that be in Georgia are of the same mind, because bloodshed in Georgia would just be an awful thing to happen. Let's say that it does go the best way that we can hope, which is to say that there's an overwhelming turnout. The election cannot be denied. Ivanishvili and his Georgian dream are kind of taken away from power, and they do whatever they do, go into exile, do whatever it is that they want to do, and the opposition comes into power in Tbilisi. Let me ask you, what kind of Georgia would you like to build?
Well,
Small
just,
question, right?
just and democratic, I would say, just and democratic, because justice has been the one thing really lacking in Georgia, and it's been problematic under all governments. So, at Georgia, where a person can trust their judiciary and can trust that their votes as well, but rights are being defended, and they can trust in that. That's the most important, I would say, and democracy as well. The two go hand in hand. You really can't have one
Yes.
without the other. And then that is what gives you the sense of freedom.
Without accountability to a judiciary,
Yes.
you can't have civil society. Without civil society, you can't build democracy. It is amazing to watch what is happening in the former Soviet Union as the empire begins to collapse. The very real dream of a liberal democracy, what you could say the American dream, the American project, this kind of Western liberal democracy idea where you build civil society, where you build the rule of law, and then you build a democracy. It's so encouraging to see that growing from a real honest, sincere place, both here in Ukraine and in Georgia. But it is an anathema to what Moscow sees as the way to hold governance. And in all of these places where I see these sprouts for democracy, it is because they have lived under this Russian system, which is now starting to fray. As I say, you see the struggle here in Ukraine. Georgia is a special place for Moscow. It's integral to their sense of empire within the Caucasus. Next door in Armenia, you see security forces leaving. You see a lot of changes in the Caucasus area. But generally, we are seeing the fact that the center cannot hold and the Russian Empire is imploding. It is falling apart. Perhaps its back is being broken here, but a loss of Georgia to Moscow's sense of empire would be also significant. Tell me a little bit about what do you think this commonality is between these countries who have actually lived under the system that the Kremlin and Moscow, because it's not. I always say, like even Ekaterinburg or Vladivostok or Murmansk suffers from the cruelty of Moscow. So their empire is not restricted to their near abroad. They do it to themselves. But as a country, as a sovereign nation that is trying to break away from the corruption and the kind of Russian-based order into a more Western liberal democracy, or how do you see that, and what does that mean for these countries that used to live under Moscow, desperately seeking to? It's not. It's the other thing I also say, and this is actually coming to a question. But the other thing that I actually say often is that the West did not expand east with NATO. The East, as soon as they could get away from Moscow, came running into the arms of the West because Moscow's dominion is cruel and it is binary. Somebody wins, somebody loses. All roads lead to Moscow. All resources are taken from the outside. The more extremities of the Russian Empire, and it all goes to Moscow. Georgia is saying no. Ukraine is saying no. The Baltics said no. We're seeing evens in Central Asia. Someday maybe Belarus when Putin is out of. What does this mean, this struggle against this old autocratic system and what you're trying to build in Georgia? What's your perception of that?
Yes. By the way, they call Russia, I don't remember who called it first, but they call Russia a self-colonizing empire because it colonizes its own population. It enslaves
I had not
its
heard
own
that before, but
population.
yes, exactly.
Yeah. And sometimes, there are debates in Georgia, for example. Someone might say that the West is the same colonizer as Russia. And then one of my friends once responded that, like as a small country, we can't be like fully fully neutral or independent anyway, and Russia is not the same colonizer as the West, because what Russia makes you into is a public bathroom, and that's really a very good expression, because they don't offer anything in return, like anything positive in return. Everything you get by being with Russia is negative. It's corruption, nepotism, low quality of everything, education, infrastructure, opportunities, like your level of competitiveness as a professional compared to the world, and so on. So Russia is not, it doesn't have soft power. It's not attractive to anyone, and that is why it resorts to hard power to keep its decaying empire. And we really see it as a holy war, the holy struggle. And in a way, it's very beautiful to be united with so many nations with the same mission and same determination as yours. Because Georgia is a very isolated language. We don't really have any linguistic or genetic historical relatives, but we have these mental relatives of the peoples who are also struggling to get liberated from Russia. And 100 years ago, it was almost the same thing, but with the difference that Russia won that time. So they were waging war with Georgia, with Ukraine, with Poland. And by the way, maybe the audience knows John Malchaz Shalikashvili. I think he was the chief of staff of the United States.
Yes.
Yes. So he was born to a Georgian fighter in Poland who fled the Russians from Georgia, went to fight them in Poland and got married there. So it's the same thing, same war happening right now, just a few hundred miles eastward in Ukraine, and not in Poland.
The difference is also Russians do not believe in a basic principle of liberal democracy that I think Georgians, Ukrainians, and all other nations fighting to be free from Moscow, and that is this. They do not believe in the idea of inalienable rights, that you are born with rights as a human being. You are not a cow. You are not a piece of chattel for the ruling elite in Moscow. You are, by rights of being born a human being, you have certain, as I say, inalienable rights. The Russian perspective is you aren't born with rights. You must fight and conquer and get rights by force, basically, by strength of will. It's a deeply cynical worldview, and it's strikingly different. And I see the difference in Georgia. It doesn't have the same mentality as Moscow.
No, definitely. Well, you're absolutely right. But that is an even more optimistic assessment of Russian mentality if you have to fight for your rights and get your rights. I think what they think is that the rights need to be bestowed on you from your master, like in Harry Potter, the master has to give you the sock to free you. Otherwise, you are never free. So you can't even... Because the Russian society does not have as big of a history of struggle for their rights as many Western societies, and usually for Westerners, it's very hard to think from a Russian perspective, because for Russia as a state, their own population does not matter either. So there were some hopes in the United States, in Europe, that the high death toll of Russian soldiers in Ukraine would matter, would revolt the population. But it does not matter. They see their own people as disposable, and a citizen means nothing. A person means nothing, which is incomprehensible for an American mind, because it's built on an individual. The United States was built on an individual, right? So that's it.
Yeah, but it is something that you in Georgia, we here in Ukraine, have in common with that. So as we kind of you wind up this conversation, which has been lovely. Thank you. The reason why I wanted so much to talk to a Georgian is to draw in for my audience an understanding that this is not just a fight in Ukraine. This is a much larger conflict with a power in Moscow, whether it's Putin or whether it is just simply the idea, which is so deeply ingrained in them, of Russian empire. And you're right, the individual in the Russian empire doesn't matter. The glory of the state is what matters. So losing dominion over their empire here in Ukraine or in Georgia is more important than any sacrifices in terms of humans that they would be willing to pay to keep this glory of Russia. Now, they're going to lose here, but it won't be for a lack of throwing soldiers at it. It'll be because they lose their prestige and their colonial foothold. Georgia is intrinsic to that colonial imperial identity as well. So all of this fight is kind of connected, but then I expand it even further as an American who firmly believes that Russia is attacking our body politic. Could you explain to my audience why you think this fight isn't limited simply to, Russia's near abroad, that Russia has aspirations to attack liberal democracies everywhere and undermine this kind of mentality because it's anathema to what they believe? Is your fight, in short, is your fight our fight?
Definitely, yes. From a micro perspective, I will just say that just on the example of this foreign agents law, also in Georgia, it might seem that it's only about one country, but as I said before, several other countries in the European Union enlargement area and also in the European Union itself, like Hungary and Slovakia, they are also eyeing the same law. And the day that the Georgian parliament overrode the presidential veto, this Serbian separatist federal party in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they announced that they will be suspending the adoption of the law until further notice. And what it means is that they will be observing what political cost the Georgian dream will pay in Georgia for introducing this law. If they get away with it, then in Bosnia there will also be the same law. And in many other states, especially in EU enlargement area, which is vulnerable to, the EU courts are not effective there yet because they're not in European Union. So they're very vulnerable to illiberal infiltration. So the stakes have been so high in Georgia, and Russia understands that. Russia understands that it will have a domino effect. So if Georgians lose their fight, and if this government stays in power, it will embolden all other governments in enlargement area first and foremost, but also in European Union and in many other states of Eurasia and maybe beyond, to bring same illiberal, restrictive, non-democratic laws that are against human freedom. Because
they want to do it in the United States.
Yeah,
it's not just Europe. They want to do it in the United States. I see them attacking our body politic all the time.
Definitely, but also weaker Europe is a problem also for United States. Mm-hmm. That's just an example of one law. So we need to win to show that public force, public resistance actually does matter. Because if we don't, then what is the signal to other civil societies around the globe that no matter how mobilized the civil society still lost? That's a very bad message, right? And on a macro scale, for Russia, the idea of freedom in the world is the enemy because they cannot sleep calm until there is freedom in the world, because they always think that from the free world there's coming infiltration into Russia and danger to their state power, a state hold over Eurasia and grip over the whatever parts of the world they have grip over, and their autocracy. So they always think that until there is freedom, their regime is never confident, and there's always danger to their regime, their autocratic regime, and their Russian world, their imperial dominance over whatever they want to dominate, and that is the large part of the world, right? So it does not matter for the free world to say that we are not the enemies for you guys to Russians. Russians will still perceive us as enemies and still undermine us, just in case we ever try to undermine them first. So
by doing the terrible thing of bringing them liberty and freedom and
exactly.
the rule of law and democracy.
Exactly.
Yes, those terrible things that the Moscow ruling elite are deadly afraid of. Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah,
are
so
you optimistic? Oh no, sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
There's no way that Moscow can be convinced that we are not enemies. They have decided it for themselves, and that's it. So we either.
So let me ask you.
We either ignore it or act on it.
Yeah. Yeah. We either ignore it or we act on it, and Russia will do what it's going to do regardless, because they're dead set on it. Let me draw this to a conclusion with one final question to you. Are you optimistic for your country's future?
Yes, because I cannot afford otherwise. And also because I see so many people who are ready to defend their country, and that's very impressive.
Well, we're defending liberal democracy and the Western way of life here in Ukraine. Ukrainians are doing it for their own, sovereign interests and their aspirations. I see it in Georgia as well, and I wish you all the very best. It is a beautiful, wonderful country that deserves, just like Ukraine, to have its own path out and away from Moscow. So, can I say Slava Sakartvelo?
Yes.
What is in the Georgian language? The name for your country is Sakartvelo.
Sakartvelo. Yes.
There we go. Slava Sakartvelo.
Slava Ukraini, and God bless America.
Thank you ever so much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, Marika Mikiashvilli.